This video demonstrates the new clinical impressions function in ED PDoc templates. In this video, we're going to demonstrate this function with a few different patients. In this case, we'll show a patient who has no previously listed problems. In the second patient, we'll demonstrate how the function works when they already have a problem listed. And in the third patient, we'll show suggested indications that go along with chief complaints. First, let's look at the architecture of the clinical impressions. Note that impressions is found under the Depart tab of ED templates. Note that an impression is a required field for this template. The top element of the impressions field is the so-called suggested from field. This patient, of course, has no suggested impressions at this time. This patient, on the other hand, has the chief complaint of abdominal pain, and tied to this chief complaint are several possible impressions that you may choose for this patient. This patient also has, in the next element, potential from problem list, 3 problems listed. The final elements of the impression fields are primary, secondary, and ruled out impressions. The only impression that's required is the primary impression. Secondary and ruled out impressions are voluntary. In addition, the template has a Meditor text field in the secondary diagnosis field. This is for those occasions where you wish to free text in your secondary and ruled out impressions. We'll first demonstrate how to put in a clinical impression when no suggested impressions nor any problems exist for the patient. We'll first click on the primary edit button. This takes you to the problem list search window, which you've seen before. You type in the problem you're searching for. I choose my problem, and it will automatically fill into the primary clinical impression field. Note that if I left-click on the primary clinical impression, it will eliminate it from the field. Now, if I right-click on the primary clinical impression, it'll change it to a ruled-out clinical impression. If I right-click it again, it'll disappear as well. Now, if I left-click on a ruled-out clinical impression, it'll change it back to a ruled-in or primary clinical impression. Now, what will happen if I choose more than one problem when choosing clinical impressions? As before, I'll choose my ankle fracture. But let's say the patient also has a chest contusion. Notice that the ankle fracture, which I chose first, is put in as the primary impression. The chest wall contusion is a secondary impression. Maybe I changed my mind and I no longer want the ankle fracture as the primary clinical impression. I simply left-click the ankle fracture, and now the chest wall contusion becomes the primary clinical impression. Now let's look at a patient who already has problems listed. In this case, the patient has congestive heart failure, hypertension, and sick sinus syndrome on their problem list. If I left-click any one of the problems, it'll add as the primary clinical indication. If I left-click another problem, it'll be added as a secondary indication. Now, if I left-click again, I'll put those diagnoses back into the problem list line. Right-clicking on any diagnosis, clinical impressions line. Right-clicking again puts it back into the problem list line. Now for our final patient, let's look at a patient who has a chief complaint who has suggested clinical impressions tied to the chief complaint. To begin with, only some chief complaints have suggested clinical impressions tied to them. We're working with ED docs throughout Centura to find good lists of suggested clinical impressions. This patient has abdominal pain, and these are fairly obvious clinical impressions that you might choose related to the complaint of abdominal pain. The function works the same with the mouse. Left-clicking will add that suggested clinical impression as the primary clinical impression. Any other left-clicking will add secondary clinical impressions. Left-clicking puts them back into the suggested line, and of course now right-clicking will add them as ruled out clinical impressions. For the final part of this video demonstration, we'd like to emphasize what happens with clinical impressions after you've completed a template. In this case, I'm going to choose small bowel obstruction as the clinical impression, and I'm going to save this document. When I go into this patient's problem list, I'll now see that small bowel obstruction has been added to the list of medical problems for this patient. One thing that's important to remember is that if you change your clinical impressions after saving your documentation and you want to remove the clinical impression from the problem list, go back into the problem list, choose that clinical impression, in this case the small bowel obstruction. You can right-click on it and you can move it to the deleted field. That way you'll keep the problem list and the clinical impressions synchronous with each other. Thank you for taking time to look at this video demonstration on the new clinical impressions.